Today is Wednesday, August 15th, 2012. We're here at the Hyatt Regency Maui for the Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference, and we're here today to interview Judge Stephen Reinhardt in a brief oral history video to record some reflections on his career in the law. I'm Ken Klee, and I'm here on behalf of the Ninth Circuit Judicial Historical Society. This interview will be preserved in the NJCHS archives, and the Historical Society will provide you with a copy for your own use. Tell us, Judge Reinhardt, about your decisions to become a lawyer. What inspired you to pursue the practice of law?
Well, I really couldn't think of what I wanted to do. And I talked to my father, who said, you ought to go to law school because it gives you good basic training for almost anything, and you can have a wide choice if you go to law school. So I went to law school, and there I was, decades later, when I became a judge, still wondering what I was really going to do. So that's how I became a lawyer, in hopes I would find something more interesting.
And when you graduated from law school, how did you start your legal career?
Well, first I went into the Pentagon and the Air Force General Counsel's office. When I graduated, everyone was supposed to do his military service. And I had been in ROTC, both in college and law school, so I had the good fortune to be selected by Nick Katzenbach, who became Attorney General and was then in the Defense Department, who had been a professor at Yale. They picked 3 of us for the Army, 3 of us for the Air Force, and we were all lieutenants, but we dressed in civilian clothes and nobody knew it, so that the generals used to come to us because we outranked the generals in the Secretary's office. So that was, they ran out of money, so I didn't do it for 3 years. They released us after 2 years, kind of like these days.
And when you were released, where did you go?
Well, a classmate of mine called me just when my term was ending, and he said, how would you like to be a law clerk? And I said, what's a law clerk? He said, oh, it's great. You spend your time, you come sit in court, then when it's all over, you write opinions for the judge. I said, that sounds like a lot of fun. He said, okay, you can take my place. He was the judge's first law clerk. The judge had been appointed to the district court because the Republicans were afraid he was going to run against, no, the Democrats were afraid, actually. He was a Republican governor of Minnesota, and the Democrats were afraid he was going to run against Hubert Humphrey. So they offered him a district court judgeship in Washington. Well, he had just come back from the Mayo Clinic where they told him he couldn't run for any office again. He had to find a softer job. So he took a job as a district judge.
And how was your clerkship experience?
Oh, it was wonderful. The judge didn't work terribly hard. He was a very decent, good man. And things were a little different then. He was in the district court for the District of Columbia. You were both the state court judge and the federal judge. There was no other judge for the district. And so we had a wide variety of things, and he would do things from granting divorces to annulments. And the case I remember the most was when some lady wanted an annulment, and we went back and talked about it later, and he said, I said, why should she get an annulment? He said, you don't understand what her husband wanted her to do. It's the kind of thing that animals do. And I said, oh, I didn't understand. So that was an interesting experience. Another one was when he lent me to another judge for the summer, and the issue was integrating the DC bar. And the judge wrote an opinion, he was from Ohio, which said that if God had meant blackbirds and bluebirds to sit on the same tree, he wouldn't have made them different colors. So he wrote an opinion that said you couldn't integrate the DC bar. So things were a little different in that time. But I had a very enjoyable experience. It was diverse.
And what did you do after your clerkship ended?
Well, I came out to California where my parents were living at the time. I intended to go back to New York to look for a job. But a lawyer that my father sent to me asked me to see one lawyer, and they didn't have a room at the firm. He said, but I want you to go to 2 other firms. And I said, I don't want to go to any. He picked up the phone, he called 2 firms, One was Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, the other was O'Melveny and Meyer. Well, I hadn't heard of any firms. But I went down to Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, and they weren't too happy to see me. We had a slight I said to them, isn't it wonderful the president just sent the troops in at Little Rock? And what a fine thing to do to protect those students. We got back from lunch, and I said, you know, I ought to tell you I'm Jewish. They said, oh, that's not a problem, but we wouldn't want to hear your liberal talk around here. So I left Gibson Dunn. I went over to O'Melveny. You would have thought I was the new crown prince. They were so happy to see me. Well, I didn't find out till 10 years later that I'd been sent down by the head of the Anti-Defamation League because they were trying to integrate O'Melveny and Myers. And that's why they were so glad to see me, because they'd been threatened with the loss of their movie business if they didn't hire a couple of Jews. But no one told me that till I'd been there, long after I'd been there. So that was my first mistake in the law.
Well, that's quite fascinating. Did you have any memorable cases while you practiced at O'Melveny?
No, I didn't, but I had some memorable encounters with other people, starting with the first day when John O'Melveny said to me, oh, you're our new white hope. And then next time I went to a cafeteria, and they were, for some reason, ended up representing a black, and he said, you know, he was representing a company, it was, and they said, he said to me, can you imagine they want us to pay $10,000 because that black guy lost an arm? So then I began to get the picture, and I was sent up to see the head of the litigation department, a man named Homer Mitchell. And he said, I've got a case for you to research. I said, yes, Mr. Mitchell. He said, I'm the commander of the yacht club. Oh, great, I said. He wanted me to research the equal protection clause to see whether you could tax yacht clubs for mooring fees and not private clubs. Came back after a little while, and I had found 2 Supreme Court cases that said you can do that with golf clubs. You can tax private clubs but not public clubs. So I told him about them. He said, what was the name of those golf clubs? I told him. He said, oh, those were Jewish clubs. I said, well, Supreme Court didn't say anything in the opinion about there being Jewish clubs. He said, those justices can tell who the Jews are. So after a while, I really got the picture that O'Melveny was not the kind of firm for me. Now, it's changed since then, but those were the days I started to practice law.
And what was the time frame for that?
2 years at O'Melveny, but 1958 to 1960, roughly.
And what did you do when you left O'Melveny?
I went to a labor firm where it represented unions and workers, and it was such a relief.
And did you have any memorable cases at the firm there?
Well, we had a lot of interesting cases, and the strike at the Herald Examiner where both sides ended up sort of being out of business. We had a lot of exciting cases at the Herald and other arbitrations. I handled an arbitration where the man was accused of pointing a gun at the I don't know whether it was the scabs or the people, when the supervisors, and the arbitrator believed him that he only had a broomstick, and he burst down into a They gave their awards right afterwards. That's what was nice about it. You didn't have to do discovery depositions. You didn't have to wait 6 months for a decision. They would have an arbitration, get a decision. He broke down into tears. He said to me, I never thought that the white arbitrator would believe a black man. He got his job back. And those were the kinds of things I really enjoyed about practicing law.
And how did you become a judge?
Well, we had a merit selection committee under Carter, and a good friend of mine was the head of the merit selection committee. And so he put me on the list, and somehow I managed to get through the committee. And then President Carter came out while this was all going on. I hadn't voted for him. I voted for Kennedy for the second term. But the mayor, Tom Bradley, was a big Carter supporter because Carter had been very good to Los Angeles. And when Carter was out here in Los Angeles, the mayor said he wanted him to do something for him. And he said, I'm putting a name in your pocket. He wrote out my name, put it in his pocket, and said, be sure to get this guy appointed to the court. I had the feeling always that Carter must have thought I was black, because he really wanted to diversify the courts. And the mayor gave him my name, and he thought, well, this must be a good diversified appointment, I suspected. But maybe he appointed me because it was merit. I don't know. Could have been.
How was your Senate confirmation process?
Terrible, horrible. I was the president of the police commission at the time, and the whole right-wing group nationally, from the FBI, the police department, so they had a law and order committee that was operated secretly. They broke it up finally, but they thought I was one of the enemy. One, I had represented unions, which they thought must have meant I was a communist. Two, they made up all kinds of stories and files that said I was a gangster, and I had a relative who was, I don't even remember his name, he was the most famous gangster in the country. They said he was one of my relatives. And they really put on a campaign. So I was held up until the end, and then Ted Kennedy made some kind of a deal with Strom Thurmond. And much to my surprise, finally I was confirmed, but it was a very unpleasant experience. I mean, you could write a book about the kinds of things that they did in the Senate then. It's, what's going on today is just easy.
Tell me about your first day on the bench, if you can remember.
Oh, I certainly can. It was the day Ronald Reagan got elected president. So one great thing for the country, one terrible thing.
And who served, if anyone, as a judicial mentor for you?
I think it was supposed to be Cliff Wallace, but I'm not sure. I know I used his book of rules, to give to the law clerks about what you're supposed to do. And the law clerks, every time when they read those rules, they say, did you write these rules? I said, no, that was Cliff Wallace. But I had a pretty good book.
And what kind of a relationship have you had with your law clerks? You mentioned when you were a clerk, you were able to draft opinions for the judges. How have you interacted with your clerks?
It's the best part of the job. You get these really bright, young, I get liberal students who really care about everything and about issues and not about going to Wall Street firms. They care about how to do things to help the country. And almost all my law clerks go into public interest law or something similar. They go into government when the government's decent. And I have a really strong relation. Most of them these last 10 years or so have become law professors. And the ones that are law professors in all the major schools, I have former clerks, they send me the new clerks that they think are the best suited for me. And so I always get really great clerks and keep in touch with quite a few of them. They're like proteges, relatives. And I really think it's the best part of the job. It's hard to do anything these days to help improve the country as a judge with the present Supreme Court we have. I manage to get reversed regularly when I try to do something decent. But I'm hoping that the law clerks that I now have that go out into the world will be able someday to improve society.
What's your impression of the United States Supreme Court and your interaction with you and the rest of the circuit?
Well, not very positive, but not uniformly so. I think we have 4 fairly decent justices who think highly of the Ninth Circuit, and 5 who don't think so highly of the Ninth Circuit. I mean, I have a good personal relationship with I guess 5 out of the 9. 4 moderates and 1 conservative who happens to have come from our court. So we were very friendly then, and it hasn't ended personally. But that doesn't stop him from reversing me generally when he can.
What do you think about their position on textualism and how it squares with your view of how justice should be administered?
Well, I don't find the Supreme Court's position on anything terribly consistent, except that 5 of them want to do the most conservative thing they can. If it takes overruling decisions, they overrule decisions. If it takes saying this is what we said when they really didn't say it, I think probably the most representative decision is Citizens United, where the issue wasn't even raised, and then they put it over and told the parties to brief it, and then went way beyond what the case was. Well, I don't find that as horrendous as many people would, but I think it's representative of their position. And that's why I think that the 4 of the 5 conservatives who didn't vote on a rather odd ground to uphold the health care bill are so upset with Justice Roberts, who I think had other reasons for upholding the bill than they wanted to rely on. And I don't believe it's all that as a result of any belief in a judicial philosophy. I think they have a belief in what the nature of the country should be that's different from mine. But I wouldn't put it on the view of different judicial reasons for reaching decisions.
What assists you in reaching a decision in your cases?
Well, there's several things. I mean, we're stuck with whatever the Supreme Court has said, and also with what our court has said. And many cases, we have no choice but just to apply something. The law is quite clear. Like immigration cases, for example, we have a large number of immigration cases where we have to do injustices to people, and most of us don't like doing it. I wouldn't say most, half of us don't like doing it. But you don't have any choice. The law is clear. On the other hand, if the law is not clear, and you can see a way to do justice, I think the law is a tool to achieve the end of justice. Now, Justice Scalia has said, I don't do justice, I do law. I think that's misunderstanding the purpose and nature of law. The end goal of law, I think, is to do justice. Now, that may be an overstatement, because in certain types of law, the goal should be to give certainty, to give guidance to people who want to engage in transactions and want to know what they're doing and be able to rely on it. That's a whole different body of law. But constitutional law and social law and things that affect people's lives, not in a business sense, but in what their basic rights are and how they can live their lives, what kind of freedom they have. There, I think the objective of law is justice, as well as in criminal law.
And in those kinds of cases where we have social justice issues at stake, how do you go about persuading your colleagues to join your views?
Well, it's getting harder and harder. It used to be fairly easy when I started in the days when Republicans were moderates. You could. I mean, I know a number of cases where people who didn't agree with me generally would end up agreeing on cases because it was fair. And I can give you an example of the English-only case in Arizona, where counting the votes, you would have voted that they would uphold the law. And Judge Kaczynski was quite certain. We had a lot of discussions before we went into that and what could be done about the case. He was on one side, I was on the other, and he finally said to me, because he'd proposed something which I had turned down, and then there was a change in the panel, so I then proposed it to him. He said, you must think I'm not very bright. I can count the votes now. So we then went in and we went around the table, and Chuck Wiggins, who had been a Republican congressman who was Nixon's biggest supporter, said, people in my district, half of them don't speak English. He said, how can I say you have to, if you want to deal with the government, you want to know what you're doing, that you have to speak English? I would think that would disenfranchise my district. And Judge Kaczynski kind of swallowed. And then we came to Mel Brunetti, who was an extremely conservative judge. And Mel said, my grandfather is Italian, and he doesn't speak English. What's he supposed to do? I can't vote for this. And so we came out right, even though we had a conservative majority. That doesn't happen as frequently these days. The conservatives are much more hardline than they were when I first came on the court.
How often does oral argument affect the outcome in your cases?
I think it does more than many judges do. You know, I find it depends on the nature of the case. I find a fair number of cases that I don't go into the argument with my mind made up at all. I guess I don't feel as certain about various fields of the law as I may about constitutional law. I mean, with constitutional law, I usually have a pretty good idea of what I think. But in other fields of the law, I don't know that much to have a real commitment till I hear the argument.
How often do you write dissenting opinions, and what factors influence your decision to dissent?
Well, if I really can't, in good conscience, agree with what the decision is, you know, either because of values I have, or just reading cases, and I just don't like to sign my name to something that I don't agree with. You know, in memorandum dispositions, I can usually overlook it because it doesn't do any harm beyond the particular decision. But in opinions where you're saying that this is what the law is and I don't agree with it, I almost always write a dissent.
Are there occasions when you'll hold up rendering a decision to see if the law changes or if the Supreme Court decides a case, or to allow time to pass?
Well, not allow time to pass, but if we know the Supreme Court's considering the issue and likely to render a decision that will affect the outcome, we ordinarily wait for the Supreme Court decision. It happens too with our cases because there are various cases with various panels, and that sometimes is a problem because it can delay the outcome too long. But if a case has priority, we generally wait for it.
What impact is serving as a judge had on your family?
Not much. Maybe it drove my children out of the law. I don't have any children. I had one who went to law school, and the day she went to law school was the last day she had anything to do with it. She went into the television or radio business and doing documentaries, and then she became a writer after she got married. But she was the closest to law. One's a musician, one's a political science professor, but nobody seemed too interested in the law. But it didn't have anything to do with the way they lived their lives, because before I became a judge, I was worked just as hard as a lawyer and did a lot of politics on the side. So I don't think they see me any less, or saw me any less when I first became a judge than they did before.
What do you like to do for fun?
Well, the only thing that I said, the only impact it has is they had a lot less money than I would have had if I'd stayed in the practice of law. But since we got an inheritance right after I became a judge, it didn't really matter that much. What do I do for fun? Well, I really like to go to sporting events, which I really can't afford anymore. When the Raiders were in town, because I had negotiated the move, I had great seats, and I used to go to every Raider game, but they moved away from me. So I used to have Lakers season tickets, but that also became too expensive. The other thing I like to go to movies. I'm a great movie fan, and I go to as many as I can. And then when I go to New York once or twice a year, I go to see as many Broadway shows as I can.
What are some of your favorite movies, thinking back over the years?
Oh, gosh, that's hard. I mean, one is A Red Badge of Courage, which my father produced and John Huston directed. So that's one I still like. Casablanca, of course, everyone loves Casablanca. 7 Year Itch, because I'm crazy about Marilyn Monroe. I really, I really don't. Oh, I know one. One's called Nashville, which was, I loved Nashville. It's a mixed political and country music show. It's about the town of Nashville, and it's a great movie. I don't think anybody remembers that. That's about it. Okay.
What are some of your most memorable cases that you've participated in?
I'd say the first one is the assisted suicide case, where I wrote the bank opinion. And someday, maybe, with a little more civilization in our country, it lost 9-0 in the Supreme Court. But they made it clear they weren't ready for it. That someday people should have a right to choose their own form of death when they're in agony and pain, and shouldn't be forced by the state to undergo that torture that they do at the end of their lives. So not only was it the right decision, but it was really a terrific decision, and that's clearly my favorite. Then I wrote the dissent in an unbanked case that said that hanging was unconstitutional. Our enlightened court voted 6-5, nothing wrong with hanging people. It was only one state that did it at the time, Washington, and they shortly thereafter abolished hanging in Washington, but we could have done it a little while earlier if we'd gotten one more vote. Another one, because it's most recent, is the one I wrote on Proposition 8 in California, about the gay marriage proposition in California, anti-gay marriage proposition, was unconstitutional. But that was a rather restrained, moderate decision, and I didn't have to and didn't reach the issue of whether gay marriage is basically not, whether a state can prohibit gay marriage, whether that would be unconstitutional. Supreme Court will get to that someday, sooner or later, but it was certainly a worthwhile and significant opinion to invalidate Proposition 8. What will happen with that in the next year or two, I don't know. The Supreme Court could do anything, but it was still a very satisfying decision. I think those are the ones. And other capital punishment decisions, in any of which we said that there should not be an execution. It was a violation of constitutional rights. Up until recent years, many of those would pass through unnoticed by the Supreme Court or unobjected to by the Supreme Court. In recent years, they can't seem to find it possible to find a case that prevents an execution. They seem not to think that that's a possible result.
Now, the Court of Appeals has a provision to allow sitting judges to take senior status. Have you considered taking senior status, and if so, what factors do you mull over in making a consideration?
Well, I haven't mulled it over or really spent much time thinking about it. I mean, it's a wonderful job. I like it. I think I can do some good, much less than previously, but some. I enjoy it. The law clerks are a big part of it. You get 4 really bright young people who have the right social conscience, the right attitudes. You get to spend a year with them and talk about issues better than talking to your colleagues about them. I mean, they're young, they have different ideas, and so it's enjoyable. I don't know really why I'd want to take senior status. I can't imagine why. When I feel I have to. I mean, my wife retired from her job a year ago because I thought it was time for her to slow down a bit. I don't feel that it's time for me to slow down. And when I do, I guess I'll take senior status.
Well, I won't ask you to single out any of your law clerks, but among your colleagues, who are some of your most memorable colleagues on the bench over the years?
Well, Judge Browning is certainly one. Judge Betty Fletcher is one. Judge Kaczynski is one. He's certainly memorable, and I'm very fond of him. You know, there've been some. Judge Canby, I think I saw here earlier, is really a fine person. I mean, there are a number of really fine colleagues. I can't say that because we got appointed that all of us are great people, or they feel like they're brothers and my sisters. How would you ever expect that if you pick 28 people for anything? They're not all going to be so great. But there's some very, very good people on the court. Law clerks, it's easier because they're almost all really good. At least after my first 10 or 15 years, then my standards improved. But some of them I can really. One of my clerks is now the governor of Massachusetts. He's the first black northern governor. I think there was one before him, and he's just terrific. I mean, not just because he's governor, not just because he's a black governor, but because he's just terrific in every way. And there are others. I mean, I have a clerk at Yale Law School who's a wonderful, pretty blonde, and she's probably going to be the next dean, and she's a remarkably nice person. But I think I'd name probably a group of 10 who are about the same. They're really outstanding. I hope they're all going to do something that makes this a better country, and I hope they'll do better at it than I have been able to.
What haven't I asked you that you'd like to tell me?
What do I really think of some of my colleagues? And what do I really think about the Supreme Court? All I can say is I hope that as a result of the next election or two, the court will move back to where it should have been. I mean, I think we're in the midst of a judicial revolution, which, if there's another conservative or two appointed, is going to be the real dismantling of the New Deal. You know, you thought that with the New Deal you settled a number of problems, you know, like you could have social legislation to benefit people. I think the majority of this Supreme Court, if they had a chance, would dismantle the New Deal. I thought we solved the problem of states' rights with the Civil War. I think a majority of this court doesn't believe in a strong national government, a strong federal government. So I thought both those problems were solved, and then we had the Warren era, which was, you know, the golden era of the judiciary, I thought. I mean, they recognized people had rights and they could help make them have a better society and assist people to realize themselves. And since those days, we've gone backwards, and the court's gone backwards, the judicial system's gone backwards. And I just hope it'll be able, with some good appointments, to change that. If not, I'm afraid the judicial world is going to be a sad place if the elections don't come out properly.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to share your views with us today and for contributing this video oral history to the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.